He received his PhD at Passau University in Germany. He graduated from the University of Juiz de Fora in Brazil with a BA in Letras and an MA in Religious Studies. And he has been the lecturer at King's Brazil Institute at King's College since September of 2014. Please welcome this panel.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the honor to host and to moderate this panel here with so distinguished guests. And well, when a Brazilian today listen the word dark clouds, we start to become very worried, considering the storm that's going on in Brazil. But we are trying to avoid speak about Brazil today here and move more into the Latin American context of the Spanish-speaking countries. And as I said, I'm very honored to be here hosting this panel with so distinguished guests. And I would like to start with Eduardo Medina-Mora, a justice of the Supreme Court of Mexico. He was also ambassador to Mexico and at the United States, and here also in UK. Well, we talk a lot about violence in Mexico, and we talk a lot of violence related to drug traffic, narco traffic. Many discussions come up on this matter, and one of the main concerns is always regarding the legalization of drugs. Many people argue that, like Uruguay did, perhaps would be a good solution to reduce the violence. I would like to ask you if you could address this point for us in the point of view of the justice.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be back in London. And certainly your question drives to a very important approach into this problem, not only for Mexico, for Latin America in general, for the world. And of course you see in the extremes an emphasis on trying to controlling the drug problem through regularization or regulation and legalization. So it's the market that should take care of that. On the other hand, you see an emphasis on strengthening the state capabilities, territorial control, policing the territory, improving the abilities of the state to fulfill its basic obligations. Maybe this debate, and in terms of these two extremes, is a false one, because you have to combine them both. You can find, of course, much better approaches in terms of policy. For instance, in Mexico, to have a law that forbids the use of the psychoactive components of cannabis for medical uses, it's nonsensical. It's inadequate, it's impertinent, and of course it can and should be changed through public policy, which is congressional action. On the other hand, the issue is for us that our problem is maybe not a drug trafficking problem, but a security problem. And it's not a national problem in the sense that it does not cover the full territory. I was just reading how the program portrays Mexico, riven by corruption and lawlessness. Well, I once visited a friend in the Pentagon who was deputy secretary in charge of intelligence, and he told me, you have to understand something. Reality is classified. And it is. Because if you see Mexico last year receiving almost as many tourists as the rest of Latin America combined, being the fourth largest automobile exporter in the world, the first producer of flat screens, well, and creating 2.5 million jobs, formal jobs. Well, if this is a country riven apart, I do not understand. But the issue is how to really focus on the issues, on the problems. And to my view, the most important element here is that we overstate the power of organized crime and understate the weakness of the state in terms of its ability institutionally to fulfill its basic job.
Thank you. Another question that came after this explanation is regarding the use of military as police. It's something we're largely discussed also in Brazil. Brazil has similar experiences like that. I would like to ask you to develop more about that. How is the development or the employment of military as police in Mexico and the legal aspect of that?
In Mexico, anywhere in the world, to use the military to perform civil public security tasks should be temporary. It's not the way things should be. So you have to develop a very large, strong police force in order to control the territory. Using the military has to be just a last resource in an emergency. Now, there is nothing more permanent than provisional solutions. And of course, it's very difficult once you give them a task to take the task away from them. And of course, building up institutions, it's a long-run task. It's maybe a generational task, but you have to keep the focus in doing that precisely. It's not a great idea because the military people in general are not well trained to perform ordinary police job. And their basic approach is not to engage with ordinary citizens with police rules of engagement. They do it in a different fashion. So you have to, of course, face the emergencies, if any, with whatever means at your hand, at your reach, but then focus in building up institutions. At the end, there is no way out. You need a very strong state, a state which is capable of delivering the basic public goods that are not to be shared with anyone, particularly the exclusive power of legitimate use of force. Second, you need, of course, the rule of law, and of course, developing the institutions and the processes through which you can solve the problems and enforce contracts, and you need accountability. Those three elements are, of course, unavoidable, and this is, to my view, the most important task ahead of us.
Thank you very much. I would move now to Juan Carlos Pinzón, who is ambassador for Colombia at the United States now and was former Minister of Defense in Colombia. No? Well, Colombia is always on the news also regarding the dialogues between FARC and the government, especially in this moment that after many back and forwards movements, it seems that we are building up a more solid peace agreement between the two forces here, if we could use this expression. In relation to narco-traffic, especially considering all the concerns of FARC involvement with narco-traffic, how you see the situation now, how you evaluate this peace agreement has been built up for quite a long time?
Well, first of all, great honor to be here. You know, this is a beautiful room and a wonderful forum, so thank you for giving us the opportunity to tell a little bit about the story of Colombia. It's a nice story, and I think it's important to discuss and look at it. Colombia, just 15, 16 years ago, was probably the most violent country in the Western Hemisphere, and in our territory were the two most violent cities in the planet. That's a little bit of the country we had. After years of effort, a lot of leadership, you know, 3 different presidents, following the same line of thought in the sense of recovering rule of law, recovering the territory, and protecting the rights and protecting the people as, you know, the main concepts. The country has been changing in a very important way. I can tell you that regarding FARC-ELN as the major guerrilla organizations, terrorist activity they had, the past 5 years, I would say they were reduced to 30% of what they were. So that's the proof of how the campaign worked ahead. And in consequence, just to give you some ideas, there were around 35% of total municipalities of Colombia without a mayor, despite being elected, or without the presence of police. None of this is anymore true. Every town in Colombia, every municipality has the presence of the state. I think it's important to tell then that this is the context of the kind of peace agreement is being discussed right now. This is a peace effort from strength. It's a peace effort in which, after 15 years of sustained campaign, now the state is in the condition to recover other tools for the government. At a point, if you go back in history, maybe only we had one choice, the use of force, always trying to do legitimate use of force. By doing this a long time, now we have recovered the possibility of using political tools and diplomacy. And that's exactly what the effort of peace is being, as it is happening right now, moving forward. Of course, doing peace sometimes is harder than making war. I don't want to underestimate what is doing war and what are the consequences. I have to tell you, I seen that. I was very proud to lead our forces to create the peace conditions in Colombia, and I saw how difficult it is and the heroism and sacrifice that is needed. But at the same time, in political terms, there's always a major consensus about that kind of effort. When you get into the peace discussion, that is a pure political discussion. How do you want to see the end game? It's not anymore how you protect the people, but how you're going to see the political organization afterwards. I think President Santos has set certain red lines that have been critical to allow this effort to move forward. On one hand, he established the idea of not to negotiate the political system or the economic model, and that's critical. Many of peace agreements resulted in sharing power or discussing property rights for someone else. So not in the case of Colombia. Second, not to discuss with those groups the future of the armed forces. This was very important. On one hand, because part of why we recovered the country, the territorial control, was precisely because we create a mixed presence of military and police. At the beginning, very focused on the military. At the end now, more focused on police. You know, as you recover the territory and you establish new rules, or better, establish the constitution to work as it is. Then, when you see what happened in other countries, in Central America probably, or in some countries in Africa, many of these agreements resulted in reducing or ending the existing security apparatus. In Colombia, it's not happening. We think the contrary. We need that security apparatus as a key condition to make peace sustainable in the future. Then, I believe it's important the idea of keeping the power of the president to use force to the last minute until there's a full set of agreements in place. This is politically costly because if you use force during a peace talk, you get two types of consequences. From the right, you will be criticized for how are you using force, you know, when these people is talking to you. From the left, you will get the same criticism, but the other way. How come you talk with terrorists and with criminals? So it's hard, but at the same time necessary. Having that tool allows the pressure to be graduated or used anytime the government, the president decides. I think that's important. And finally, the idea that we were not going to accept any kind of impunity in war crimes or in crimes against humanity. I think that's very important. First, because of high moral standards from Colombian state, from the way we have evolved as a society and the hope and will we have as a nation. But second, because of our international obligations. You know, you have to comply today to IHL, you have to comply to the International Court standards. So this is why we have been developing the concept of a transitional justice system that will allow justice to be served. Your final comment on drugs. No doubt, drug trafficking as illegal mining, and I explained these two, extortion and kidnapping, have been the sources of funding for criminals, in general terms, in the world, certainly in Latin America, and in the case of the Colombian conflict, without doubt. Of course, there is a big expectation. The peace should reduce those problems and at least should put some of those actors to be now not on the wrong side, but being helpful. But on the other side, we cannot be naive to think that that's going to be 100% effective and things will just vanish. And that's where you need to keep strong intelligence effort and strong capabilities to perform against those crimes. Not to forget, as you explained very well, the idea of development and really stabilizing these regions with the idea of taking what we have never taken really, development opportunities and connecting these isolated municipalities to the rest of the country.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. I would like now to come to Daniel Lansberg-Rodriguez, who is a director of Latin America region at Greenmantle LLC. Well, talking about Venezuela, I think we have some points in common here that can help us also to try to understand this bigger picture of Latin American countries now. Talking about rule of law, development, and observing what's going on in Venezuela today, how could you address that? How this, the conflictuous political arena in Venezuela and also economic arena, it's influencing the security issue in the country?
That's a wonderful question, and I wanted to also thank you all for having had me here on with such distinguished colleagues here on the panel. I believe traditionally you give bad news first and then give good news to sort of, take some of the edge off of that. And on this panel, we seem to have reversed that because Mexico and Colombia are, to a certain extent, on the up and up, and Venezuela is falling drastically in the other direction. We are riven by corruption and chaos. It's not something that's really deniable. Dark clouds would actually be the best possible news because there's no water and there's no electricity. Really any change from the status quo would be upside. I think the sort of most concise explanation or the most concise way of describing Venezuela at the moment would be a country in a hellish holding pattern. There is a lot of instability, there are a lot of problems, each one of which is getting worse. But at the same time, there is a political system that has been built up to stymie any type of change that might otherwise take place. In December, as many of you may know, we had legislative elections in Venezuela, at which time the opposition received an unprecedented supermajority in the Congress, which would normally be a potential signal for a transition. But Venezuela has what we call a quinceañera constitution. Our constitution is 15 years old, and it's never had separation of powers before. It has never really had a political transition before, and it is very badly equipped to handle it. The president in Venezuela technically has no veto power, but they can send any legislation to the Supreme Court to find out if it is constitutional or not. And surprisingly, there hasn't been a single bill that the new legislature has passed that is proven constitutional. But then again, they're new to their jobs. They're just still getting used to it. I'm sure they'll get there eventually. But it's something that's incredibly destabilizing because what we're seeing right now throughout the Latin American region is when the boom cycle became a bust cycle, presidents that had been in the 50 to 60% approval rating across the board went into the 20s. Dilma, I believe, is at 7. Santos is in the 25, 26 range, I think. The only presidents who are popular in Latin America right now are the ones who came later. It's Guatemala, it's Argentina, and even those are, 50s, low 50s. It's a very tough time to be a Latin American leader. And Maduro is no exception. He's in the 20s. The difference is, while a lot of other countries have some kind of constitutional mechanism in place, some kind of institutional mechanism in place for that to mean something, for large-scale public rejection of the executive to translate into some kind of political change, either by the current regime or by a new one, Venezuela is very much designed to channel the president into the government. There's very little difference. And that creates a vacuum because Maduro doesn't do much presidenting. And it has caused a situation where Venezuela was in recession before the price of oil collapsed. And it has only gotten worse since then. What the government has done largely is manufacture crises to distract popular attention away from that. So a few months ago, the age-old territorial dispute with neighboring Guyana, which is sort of like a Falklands Islands situation, but a lot bigger and with gold and with oil, was, which all Venezuelans grow up thinking, that territory is ours, was brought front and center. So that you already have a national wave of approval for the presidency. There have been, I believe to date, 18 alleged coup attempts against Maduro. No one has ever seen them, but every now and then he'll go on TV and say, "Oh, we just stopped a coup attempt. Everybody relax. We have the situation under control." And and as the circuses get more and more frequent, the bread gets less and less available. Venezuela, this is, I think, a larger problem. Latin Americans, there's an old joke that we never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And during a decade-long commodity boom, there was very little diversification. And some countries, like Chile, managed to build up a sovereign wealth fund, but Venezuela didn't. Venezuela opted to use those resources to essentially take a medium-sized, middle-income country and try and turn it into a geopolitical power player, which was a very expensive proposition. And that used a lot of what had been a $1 trillion windfall, or would otherwise have been a $1 trillion windfall. Take that and then add to it graft, corruption, misuse projects that were never completed. And now Venezuela is essentially broke. And it is a system that is very poorly designed to be broke. And as a result, the government's methods for controlling the population are getting much more aggressive. Machiavelli says that you can be loved or you can be feared, and he recommends being feared because you can control it easier. That has been, Chavez was loved. I have a lot of criticisms I could say about Hugo Chavez, but he was loved by the people. Maduro isn't, and it's a system that hasn't quite gotten used to that. And that creates a lot of rifts, both within Chavismo and the opposition, as to how to either capitalize on that or defend on it. People have been saying that Chavismo is at death's door for a decade, and it always survives. If there's one thing that Chavismo knows how to do well, it's survival. If they were half as good at governing as simply surviving, Venezuela would be Chile or Colombia or Mexico. But a lot of times, they manage to snatch survival out of the sort of hands of defeat, which is actually somewhat lucky because Venezuela, I think, is a giant, enormous political and security threat for the region. We haven't had a large failed state in South America for a long time. We've had regions of countries that are not under national control. We've had guerrilla movements, but we haven't had a proper failed state. And Venezuela is enormous. It's got 30 million people. It's got the world's largest oil reserves, and it has been arming itself more and more with civilian pro-government paramilitary groups. The military expenditures in Venezuela have been among the highest in the region, even though it hasn't been to war since independence. It is a powder keg, which could very much destabilize the neighborhood, particularly Colombia, which has already seen a lot of border issues with Venezuela flare up. So it is something that the world should pay attention to. Venezuela, I think largely because of our leadership, people are used to laughing at it instead of being scared at it. The president comes on, he says something crazy, and everybody sort of snickers. But behind that, behind sort of that wall of comic opera leadership, there's actually, I think, a pretty sizable destabilizing threat for the region.
So, Daniel, thank you very much, and I think we can start now to put together some open question for the three of you. Well, when we talk about Latin America in general, the tendency to see like a unit, a monolithic part of the world that we share a lot in common, and the problems are similar, and also the realities are similar, and we have the tendency, when we are not there, to not see the specificities of each one of the countries that we have there. I will be back to the question of, for example, narcotraffic. That's a common problem for the countries that we are talking here, but I can see that the approach to the narcotraffic in each one of these countries is quite different. So I would like to ask you to address some lines about the question of narcotraffic inside Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela in opposition to each other.
Well, of course, narcotraffic is an international value-added chain, and you have to understand that to really see how to assess the impact in one single country. Mexico is a very large geographically and a very large economy, and also diversified geography. If you consider the value added for drug trafficking in Mexico, which is assessed at the neighborhood of $30 billion. It's a lot of money. But it is just below 2% of GDP. So it's not really driving the country. Manufacturing is, tourism is, services are, and Mexico in that sense, vis-a-vis Latin America, is part of North America, and there is no way out. We are so linked with the US in terms of demography, in terms of trade, in terms of geography. Everything is really going together. Now, we are part of Latin America. We share values, language, and we have a lot of common ground with Latin America. But our daily lives are driven by our relationship with the US. This is North America. We have to see, and this is my view, that the southern border of North America is not the Suchiate, the river that divides Mexico and Guatemala. It's the Darien, the jungle that divides Panama and Colombia. Because the equation of security and prosperity in North America cannot be solved without looking at this region together. Now, we do have a lot in common with Latin America, with South America. We have the Pacific Alliance with Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And we certainly want to engage more with the region. But certainly we have separate realities in this sense. And we have to start from the common ground to build up a new approach which is useful for all of us.
I first of all will be interested in reminding everybody how Latin America looks in terms of security. Usually it's not part of these discussions, you know, of global security forums. You will not see Latin America because we don't have countries with nuclear weapons. We don't have countries that are prone to have major conquers or confront each other. So it's not the case in Latin America. But on the other side is the region of the world in which more homicides typically occur. And that's an interesting feature to look. So maybe we might not be a region at risk in terms of typical national security analysis, but we are a region with a lot of challenges from the inside, a lot of violence happening. On one hand, you can get into, of course, in-depth discussion about development, about inequality, and those are features that, of course, matter. But on the other side, we cannot forget this idea of transnational crime really happening and taking advantage of the borders of our countries that we respect very much. Actually, we're very respectful about borders in Latin America, considering the idea of a very Pacific region, peaceful region will be the right word. But on the other side, criminals don't care about it. And they just move illegal mining from the south to Europe or to the north. They move drug trafficking to the United States, crossing Colombia, Central America, Mexico, getting to the US, or moving through Venezuela and to Brazil and places in Africa, and from Africa to the European countries. So those are issues that are happening and continue to happen. The case of Colombia, I think we have done a major effort to confront those types of crimes and, making them less profitable, if you want. We have been making the business environment for crime more difficult in Colombia. But it had consequences as well, because this is about rent seeking. So they can move to other parts of the region, and that's why in the recent years we have become somehow a country very interested in helping others. There's a major effort of Colombia these days in coordination with the United States and other countries to contribute to train forces in Central America, what is called the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, but also in countries in South America like Paraguay, Peru, certainly in the case of Mexico, with a lot of cooperation. I think anyhow it's important as well to look on different political approaches. You described very well that there are some countries that are focusing on different issues than others. What has been seen recently is different approaches. So Pacific Alliance, for instance, in which Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile have organized, is an interesting approach. It's not so formal, so it's not a trade agreement in which every country has obligations, but it's more about sharing values. We share democratic values, we share market values, and we share the idea that the Pacific is the place in which most of the economy is happening. But somehow that has been seen in some cases as opposing to other ways of approaches. That will be a little bit of general perspective on the whole strategic view in Latin America.
So our relationship, or Venezuela's relationship with drugs, is a little bit different. Venezuela, so there's an old quote by a Roman emperor, Septimus Severus, which says, "To be harmonious, you must enrich the soldiers and can scorn all others." And that has been Nicolas Maduro's, basically his modus operandi. There has been a huge focus on keeping the military happy. To make sure that as a civilian government, the military would have trouble imagining a situation where they would have more influence and more impunity than they have now. That before used to happen through wealth transfers, through higher salaries, through more hardware, but that was when oil was at 100. Now that oil is between 30, 40, you don't really have that spending capacity. But one way to enrich the military is to give them money. Another one is to give them more influence that's monetizable. And that is essentially what has gone on. So for example, gasoline is free in Venezuela. In Colombia, it's roughly market price. If you control the border between the two, that makes gasoline very lucrative, much more than what would be, a 3-5% raise a year for the soldiers. If that's not enough money, then you can shut the border with Colombia and make it even more difficult to move legally. That raises the margins even more. So policymaking has become a proxy for facilitating essentially illicit enrichment. So that is something that spills over quite obviously into narcotic realms, where we've had several generals, high-ranking members of the government who've been implicated by international forums, who've been accused in various respects of being either participatory or sort of turning a benign eye towards these sorts of in Venezuela we'd say kikiriwikis, but I'm like a shenanigan. And that's something that has, we've had 15 years of impunity in Venezuela, and that's something that's, I think, going to be very difficult to turn off. And one of the harder parts of a transition is, or a potential transition is, taking, a population that's used to impunity and arbitrage and, sort of entrepreneurially working the system to find a way to, create something more stable, like Colombia did. I mean, Colombia is a huge inspiration for us, that going from what was essentially a failed state in 2002 to the investment and tourism darling of the continent, that is, if Colombia could do it, there may be hope for us, but there's a lot of complicated battles ahead beforehand.
Thank you. I am tempted to put more questions to you, but I think it's more just to open to the ground. And if you have questions, please, the first one there.
My name is Juan. I'm a retired U.S. Army officer and a proud member of the Clark-Urban Homeland Security Group at Aspen. My question is about, we haven't touched on Cuba and the emerging relationship between the United States and Cuba, and how is that viewed elsewhere within Latin America?
Well, Cuba is very important for the region. Mexico was the only country in the hemisphere that never broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. And of course, Cuba has had a very strong influence in insurgent movements throughout Latin America, maybe with the exception of Mexico, because precisely we kept this closeness. Now, Cuba emerges as a different reality. I mean, the embargo and all this policy approach has been nonsensical for Cuba and for the US. I think that the opportunity now is to change that and open opportunities for the Cubans. Now, Cuba, in that sense, can play a role to improve the quality of life of people in the island. And the future of Cuba has to be decided by people in the island, not people in Miami. And this is very important to understand. Now, how to really trigger that is up to the Cubans to decide. We don't see Cuba, for instance, as a threat in terms of now the 33 million tourists that are coming to Mexico are going to go to Cuba. Well, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the capabilities. The median age in Cuba is 40, they are as old as Europe. So there is no way you can actually envision that towards the future. But I think that everyone in the region helping Cuba to improve its own standard of living and its own democracy is going to be a good thing. And I think that what the US has done and Cuba has done now in terms of trying to break this long-standing, nonsensical approach to each other is only good for them and for the region.
If I might add a little bit from the other perspective, it was Cuba liberalizing was something that came as a bit of a shock in Venezuela. Cuba and Venezuela had forged a very close relationship. We sold them oil, which was either for resale or for, there's questions as to what was done with the oil, and they would give us back doctors. There was a sense to which Cuba and the embargo was a validating force for why a left-wing revolution was necessary and appropriate in Venezuela. It made it easier to vilify the United States, and when you had that transition, I would never have imagined a world where Cuba would have an ambassador from the United States and Caracas wouldn't. So that has now isolated the Venezuelan government considerably from an area in which they never really expected to be isolated, which is part of and is also a bit of a bellwether, part of a larger pattern in which you see leftist revolutionary movements very strongly sort of on the defensive, on the wane throughout the region. Peru, their second round election doesn't even have a leftist candidate. And that's something that's very unusual for Latin America. And in Venezuela, it's lost a lot of credibility, and the fact that Cuba is changing, that Cuba is opting to change with the same regime, is something that's being watched very closely, because one of the major questions among the government is, what is our exit plan? What happens if we're not in power? What happens to us? And whether or not the transition in Cuba is something that is going to be, as the judge said, designated by Miami or designated on the island, is something that is really something that could facilitate or frustrate a potential transition in Venezuela.
Do you have comments on that?
No, I think two positions were said. Maybe a line, Cuba is Latin America anyway, and I think that in general terms, despite we are different and every nation looks as it is, by some reason we are peaceful among each other. And I think it's a way to demonstrate that they were seen anyway as Latin America and they were isolated. That on the positive of Latin America perspective. But on the other side, I think because of the kind of policy that was applied, that probably was appropriated for different time. I think policies have cycles, and they can be of use on different times for different purposes. What I think is that create a complexity for Cuba, and suddenly they became, I would say, very influential in politics in Latin America, despite they were impoverished and being only a 12 million people island, and sometimes more influencers than larger countries. So I guess what's going to happen now is that they were going to be a little bit another country in the region, and frankly, they will be valued for their presence, their real presence.
Wonderful. We have time for a second question. Yes, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One. I'm a Pentagon reporter from Washington, and from my perspective in Washington, the security story that we hear usually starts with how big is Trump's wall going to be? Or from Pentagon reporters, national security reporters, usually it's what's the latest level of influence from Iran and Hezbollah infiltrating Latin America, or what's the drug trade? So what I want to ask you gentlemen is, what is Washington missing? What are you not getting enough from that you think you need, both for Latin American security, all the way down to South American security, and what are the American people missing about the real story?
The good news for Mexico, and I would say for Latin America, is that the State Department and the Pentagon are not paying enough attention to us. The security and intelligence community is, for a good reason, focusing on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and cyber. Organized crime is not into the equation, insurgency is not into the equation, so we are not certainly a matter of concern. Now, there is a lot of opportunity in terms of cooperation, how to build up better and more reliable democratic institutions in the region. And there is no way that the US can envision its own security equation without Latin America. This is the region. This is, of course, in the State Department, you see everyone focusing elsewhere. But at the end, it would be a very good idea to look at each other and try to figure out how to build up a better region, improving the standards of living. If you see our regional organization, the Organization of American States, well, it's not functioning very well, and it's not receiving enough attention from the US, and I would say from Latin America as well. And we can and should change that.
Well, maybe I think Eduardo described this very well. We are not in the center of the problems, and probably it's related to what I described before. We don't have these major threats that are existential, but I think it's important to keep developing and evolving the cooperation. I think the model that we developed particularly Colombia and the US, enabling institutions and somehow keep fighting those kind of threats that anyway take lives and on the other side create violence and instability is important. And I think as much as we can do that in the countries that sometimes doesn't have the real capabilities to confront, and I've seen that in some Central American countries or in the Caribbean, we better do that before they really become a serious problem. But I think cooperation is a good answer, and I think that's a little bit of what should be done. As much as we can do that, I think we can keep moving forward. Sounds too obvious, the answer, but really it's about that. And really, I would say, is because sometimes, the powers have to be so overstretched, look into so complex problems that we have here today that we forget that other problems can become major problems if you lose sight. Not to forget, Latin America is anyway 500 million people, so it's quite sizable. Just giving you some idea about the size of Colombia, it's almost 5 times you can put the UK inside Colombia. 3.2 times you can put Germany inside Colombia. I'm just talking about Colombia, which is not the largest country. Brazil is largest, Mexico is largest, even Peru in size is largest. So just to think about this way, Latin America is a good way to balance and see how things are. Not to forget about the aging of population. The world is aging while Latin America continues to be one of these young regions in which almost 60% of the people is below 30 years old. I think that's a very important issue to consider about the region.
And just very briefly, I think that to keep in mind sort of the transience of things, the effervescence of these countries, with some exceptions, and Mexico is one, which has been reasonably stable for 100 years. Today's Chile can be tomorrow's Venezuela and vice versa. We were Chile in the 60s and 70s. Venezuela was the functional democracy in the region. Cold warriors used to write about whether Venezuelan exceptionalism was an exportable model to other countries in the region. But sometimes the intelligence community has a tendency to put countries in the don't have to worry about box, and that's when you most have to worry about them. Because in countries where, like Venezuela has had 26 constitutions in 200 years, that is not terribly stable. And this is a phenomenon that is very common in Latin America. A lot of governments tend to view things not as they are, but as they could be. And sometimes that creates massive shifts from left to right and back again, which can be destabilizing and which can catch people off guard. Even people living in those countries don't necessarily know it's happening until it's already happened. So, I mean, I think that they shouldn't just be looking at Venezuela because it's a mess, or at Brazil, but it'll probably be okay because it's Brazil. You really have to, be looking, sort of where you least expect, at least glancing at it occasionally, because if not, these things can creep up very quickly.
Well, I think we ran out of time, and I would like to thank you for your attention and participation, and especially to thank our guests here for this very impressive and illustrating talk with us. I would like to invite us to join in a thank you to them.